It was raining cats and dogs. I was still halfway from my home city. The business meeting took much longer than expected. I always had a problem driving after sunset. Somehow my eyesight failed after the sun went down, and the rain that day made it worse. Thankfully, the highway was empty, except for a car or two every few minutes. Generally, I refrained from driving in the dark, but that night I had no choice. Raindrops clashed hard against the windscreen as milestones flashed by the windows. I just wanted to reach my home as soon as possible. My heart was aching for a glass of scotch. As I drowned further in my thoughts, I thought I saw a silhouette on the side of the road. As I slowed down, the figure became clearer. It was a man, holding a large umbrella over his head, his other arm extended, asking for a lift. I was apprehensive at first. The stranger could be a thief or a kidnapper or a murderer, but then my charitable side took over. I stopped the car and rolled down my window. The man leaned on the door, the umbrella covering his head and his back. "I am extremely sorry for the inconvenience. My car broke down and I can't get a mechanic in this weather. It would be very kind of you if you could drop me at my home. It's not far from here," he said in a gravelly voice. "Yes, of course. It's raining like hell. Please get inside." I took a good look at him as he walked towards the passenger side of my car. He was tall, must have been more than 6 feet in height, wearing a two-piece suit. As he got inside, I could see he was completely drenched. "Hello, I am Suresh. Thank you for giving the lift. I was standing there for half an hour and not one car stopped," he said, extending his hand. "Can't really blame them, can we? Too many unscrupulous elements around." "I am Abhishek, by the way," I said, shaking his hand. His hand was colder than expected. The rain suddenly increased in intensity as he sat in the passenger seat. I started the car and drove off. The rain increased continuously till a point that I couldn't see the road anymore. The stranger beside me was visibly worried. "Would you be able to drive to your home in this weather?" he asked. "I have to. I have an important meeting tomorrow morning." "Safety is foremost, isn't it? Why don't you spend the night at my place and leave early morning directly for your meeting?" No, I can't do that." I said, "I won't like to burden you." "Come on, it's no burden. I live alone. I'd prefer the company. You seem to be a nice guy." I contemplated. It was raining heavily, and I could feel the tires of my car skidding from time to time. It was better to stay the night and start as soon as the rain stopped. "All right, I think it's better to heed your advice. Let's reach your place as soon as possible." The following journey was uneventful. Trees on the sides of the road passed on like a blur. The downpour drowned the sound of the car engine. Around 20 minutes later, Suresh asked me to take a right onto a smaller road. A large signboard read, "Nagar Haveli, 100 meters ahead." I asked, "Whose mansion is that? The name sounds very old." "It's my ancestral home. We have been staying there for generations. My parents would have been glad to see you, but unfortunately they are on a Europe tour." "That's absolutely fine. It's more than enough that you have invited me in this weather." A big mansion rose over the horizon as I drove ahead. It was more of a palace than a mansion. Golden domes rose into the sky, reminiscent of an era of kings and queens. The rest of the palace was adorned in white, oozing a massive status symbol. I wondered, how can a man stay alone in this huge place? As we reached the gate, Suresh excused himself and got out of the car. He went to the left side of the gate and punched in the security code. The gates opened and I crossed the gates and stopped for Suresh. He walked in and got into the car. The gates closed after him. I drove slowly through the cobblestone path into a well-lit porch. The whole place was well maintained. Topiaries were on both sides of the path, with adjacent gardens. Everything was neat and orderly. I envied Suresh's life. Suresh asked me to park the car in the porch itself, as he wasn't expecting any visitors for the evening. I got out of the car and walked towards the massive front door. The craftsmanship on the door spoke volumes about the rich heritage. I couldn't help but get amazed at every bit of design on the walls. I followed Suresh through the main door and entered into their large drawing room. I was stupefied. It was a massive, monumental room with a white couch and claret armchairs matching the walls. A large mahogany table stood between the couch and the chairs, whose other end faced a fireplace. Dark charcoal marble floors complemented the design of the room. Large portraits of Suresh's ancestors hung on the walls. At the other end of the room, a large staircase led to the first floor. Just below the staircase was the liquor cabinet on one side, and on the other, a showcase adorned with showpieces and various trophies. Suresh beckoned me towards the couch. "I'll be back after putting on something dry. Please have a seat." And he climbed up the stairs. I walked towards one of the chairs and sat down. I was busy checking emails on my phone when Suresh came down, dressed in pajamas and a nightgown. "Would you like some scotch?" I was delighted to hear those words. Yes, I'd love some. He took out 2 glasses from the liquor cabinet and a half-filled glass bottle. He put down the glasses on the table and poured the drink till both the glasses were half full. He sat down with his glass in his hand. I took my glass and said, "Cheers." "I never expected this night to turn out this way," I said. "Me neither, but I am glad to have the company. Staying alone in this big house is quite boring." "Yes, I can understand." "So, where do you work?" "I own a small marketing company. We handle publicity and marketing for various consumer goods." "Wow, that's great. What were you doing here tonight?" "I was attending a meeting with a new client. I didn't expect it to take so long. To make matters worse, it started raining." "I can see. At least you didn't have to risk your life. How are you enjoying your drink?" "It's amazing. How old is it?" "I think around 20 years. Dad bought it last year." We had finished our first drink by then. Suresh poured another drink. I was intrigued about the past of Suresh's home, so I asked him about it. "This house is about 100 years old. My great-grandfather was very young when he started building this house. It was finally finished when my grandfather was a teenager." "Your house seems to have a rich heritage. Was your great-grandfather a zamindar or something?" "Yes, he was, and unlike most zamindars of that time, he was kind-hearted. Though there was one incident because of which he was murdered in the end." "What? He was murdered? By whom? And why?" "Even though he was kind-hearted, he had a bad temper," he said slowly. "One day, he had gone to a nearby village to collect taxes. There, he found out that one of the villagers was stealing grains from others and was selling them on the black market. He lost it completely. He ordered that man to be brought in front of him and had him beaten to death." "Okay, that's gruesome. What happened after that?" "The incident didn't sit well with the accomplices of the dead thief. They were hardcore criminals. One night, my great-grandfather was alone in the mansion. Everyone else had gone to a fair in the largest village in this area, the city you had your meeting today. Seeing the opportunity, those people attacked the mansion. They robbed as much as they could and murdered my great-grandfather when he tried to resist them. When everybody came back, nobody could find his dead body. Blood was everywhere. Strewn about objects told the whole story. His body hasn't been found till date." "That's horrific. How did your family deal with it after that?" "My grandfather was old enough by that time. He held the helm of the affairs. In time, he also tracked down the assailants' whereabouts, but they were already dead. Rumors said that all of them died under mysterious circumstances." "Wow, it sounds like some ghost story. Was your great-grandfather somehow connected to it?" I asked jokingly. Suresh's face was serious now. "We don't joke about these things here. We have felt an unknown presence from time to time. I'm not comfortable talking about it." "I am extremely sorry. But you are telling me that the mansion is haunted?" "Kind of. We don't poke at it. Certain incidents happen, but we don't prod. I think it's late enough. Let's have our dinner and go to sleep." "Yes, of course." Saying that, we finished our drinks and went to the dining hall. Needless to say, it was another marvel to look at. The dining table had a marble top with 10 chairs around it, each made of mahogany. Food was already kept on the table. The cook had left long ago. We served the food in our plates and heated on the microwave oven. Suresh was silent whole of the time. I decided to let him be. We had our dinner with minimal conversation. After dinner, we went upstairs, which housed all the bedrooms and a few other rooms. The bedrooms were adjacent to each other along a carpeted passage. Suresh showed me to the guest bedroom, which was at the end of the passage. Facing the room was a study. Suresh's room was 2 doors down along the same passage. The guest room was lavish, with a 4-poster king-size bed at the center. The whole floor was covered with a thick carpet. The bed was accompanied by 2 side tables with table lamps on top of them. Just beside the door was an almirah, and on the other side an attached bathroom. A large French window faced the door, covered with handmade curtains. I was too tired to move anymore. Before leaving for the night, Suresh said something that sent a chill down my spine. Whatever happens, don't get out of your room in the night. You might hear weird sounds or something similar. Just stay in your room. Don't ask why. Okay, it's eerie, but okay. I went to my bed, took off my shirt and trousers, and went off to sleep. It was still raining hard outside. It must have been around 3 a.m. that I heard loud raps on the bedroom door. It took me a moment to regain my senses. The knocking continued, while saying, "I am coming," in a loud voice. I got down from my bed. I switched on the bed lamp and walked up to the door, still groggy. The knocking continued. I assumed it must be Suresh in some kind of emergency. I opened the door, and there was nobody. Something cold brushed past my face, and suddenly I was freezing. I closed the door in a hurry and sat down on the floor. I was trembling with cold and fear. Suddenly, the door started banging loudly. I crawled back to the foot of the bed. I could feel hairs on my neck standing up. A cold sweat broke across my face. The banging stopped all of a sudden. I was hoping for Suresh to come my rescue, but he was nowhere to be seen. I decided to go to his room. I had completely forgotten what he had said before going to sleep. I stepped out of my room slowly. I looked at both sides of the door. A strange darkness shrouded the passage. I switched on the flashlight of my cell phone and tiptoed to Suresh's room. His door was wide open. I was taken aback. He was supposed to be in his room. I went inside. His bed was empty, blankets strewn aside as if he had just left his bed. I checked his washroom, which again was empty. Branches of a tree were banging against his bedroom window, creating a ghostly atmosphere. I strode out of the room and went downstairs. The sight shocked me. The main door was ajar. The whole house was covered in the same darkness. I went outside. Rain stormed like mad, accompanied by lightning every now and then. I stood in the porch for a while trying to find Suresh, but he was nowhere to be seen. I was worried if something happened to him. I went to my car and opened his trunk. I took out the tire iron, closed the trunk, and went beyond the porch towards the main gate. Another lightning cracked, followed by thunder. Everything was illuminated for a fraction of a second. I saw a dark figure near the gate. It must be Suresh. I ran ahead, but by the time I reached the gate, the figure was gone. Another lightning. I saw the figure walk towards the garden. I ran behind it. Another lightning. The figure disappeared, but I saw Suresh in his nightgown, completely drenched, standing with a shovel in his hand near a freshly dug ditch. "Suresh, what are you doing here in the rain?" "Abhishek, do you know who my great-grandfather really was? He was a bloodthirsty monster. He killed people for fun. The kind-hearted nature was just a facade. He even killed his son's wife, my own grandmother, when she was pregnant for the second time." "What the hell are you talking about?" "Yes, that's my great-grandfather, and guess what? His blood runs in my veins. You shouldn't have given me the lift." And he stepped forward to strike me with the shovel. I couldn't step back in time, and the shovel passed through me. I smiled at him. All blood was drained from his face. He stepped back in shock. I was still smiling at him. He stuttered, What the hell are you?" "You don't need to know anymore," and I hit his head with my tire iron. His skull cracked with a loud sound, and he fell in the ditch he dug up. Rain had slowed down by then. It was time for sunrise, and that meant my time was almost up. Rosie and her husband, Gard, lived in an old beige farmhouse in the country. They expected their son Stephen and his wife Laura to visit them. Rosie cleaned the house and prepared the upstairs bedroom so the guests could sleep peacefully and have some privacy. After having dinner and catching up with minor chit-chat, the visiting couple excused themselves and settled upstairs for the night. Laura could not sleep well that night. She glanced over at her husband, who was already sleeping peacefully. She was envious of how he could fall asleep so quickly. Out of the corner of her eyes, she could have sworn that she saw someone move in the room's shadows. No one else was with them. Laura knew it could not have been Vincent, since that accident had happened before Stephen was born, and he wouldn't be this far into the house. Laura was about to wake her husband when it floated towards them and stared down. She closed her eyes, trying to pretend that she was asleep. Even with her eyes closed, it did not go away. Instead, the shadow lay across her and Stephen's legs, preventing them from moving. Laura did her best to sleep, and eventually she could. When morning came, her husband was the first to wake fully rested, while Laura was tired and anxious. "Everything okay, Laura?" "Stephen, I know your folks have a ghost, but is the attic haunted too?" Stephen looked at her confused. "Not that I'm aware." Laura nodded and rubbed her arms as a chill ran through her. "Last night, there was a shadow in the corner of the room." Her eyes looked at the spot where she had seen it. "It walked over and laid across our legs." Her husband looked to where she was looking and squinted his eyes. "Are you sure it wasn't just sleep paralysis?" Laura shook her head. She knew it wasn't sleep paralysis. The shadow she had seen was real. At breakfast, Laura asked her in-laws if they knew anything about it. "A man in the attic?" Guard pondered. "I believe a doctor used to live here before I bought the house. It may be him or a patient he lost." Laura turned to her husband, surprised to hear this because it confirmed what she had experienced last night. Stephen gave her a reassuring smile and held her hand. "So, how long have you two known about it?" Stephen asked his parents. "Well, it all started with the stairs," Rosie said, looking towards the stairs across from the dining table where the stairs led up to the second floor. "We hear footsteps walk up then down," Guard explained. "The door wouldn't open and close, but there would be footsteps overhead as if someone was stomping around," Rosie added. Laura's husband was quiet. He had lived here his entire life and never knew anything about it. Now, suddenly, this entity decided to make itself known. From here on out, it would continue to do so every time they came back to visit. It was also the last time Laura slept in the upstairs bedroom. One night in the fall of 2017, I got off work at about 11 p.m. and went to the local bar by my house like I usually did for a few drinks before going home. When I got to the bar, there was only one other person in the bar, playing a casino machine. Let's call him Steve. I ordered my drink and began chatting a bartender, a guy I got along well with. "Slow night?" I asked. The bartender told me that he had only 3 people in all night, including me. Shortly after, Steve walked up and cashed out a ticket for a few cents. He said something about losing his rent money before laughing and ordering a drink. Steve and I got to talking about nothing important, things like the weather and sports. At about 1:15 a.m., another guy had seen around the bar a few times before walked in and began playing the machines. I knew his name was Jimmy, but that was about it. I stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, and the Steve followed me. Outside, he asked if he could bum a smoke. I gave him one, and we continued our conversation, which had changed about what I did for work and if I lived around the area. I told him what I did for work and lived only a few blocks away. Honestly, I thought nothing of it. When I asked him the same questions, Steve said that he was in between jobs and lived nearby. We walked back inside, and the bartender called last call at about 1:30 a.m. I bought another drink and a 6-pack to take home. I also bought Steve a drink, since he seemed like a cool guy. At about 1:40 a.m., I finished my drink and said goodbye to the bartender and Steve. As I was leaving, I heard the Jimmy yell that he had gotten into the bonus round on the machine. I got into my car and drove home. The next day, I went to work at about 2:30 p.m. When I arrived, I went into the locker room and began to put on my uniform when my boss walked in saying that he needed to see me in his office immediately. I followed him to his office, and when I entered, there were 2 detectives waiting. The boss told me that they needed to speak with me before leaving us alone in his office. I asked the detectives what was going on. One of them, let's call him Bill, showed me a picture and asked if I knew who it was. It was a photo of Steve. I told Bill that I'd met him at the bar last night and asked what all this was about. Bill explained that that very morning a man had been found murdered in a park not far from the bar I was at. Not just murdered, decapitated. Bill asked me to tell him everything I remembered from the night prior, which I did. Bill then pulled out his laptop and showed me surveillance footage from the bar, which showed Steve and I speaking and smoking a cigarette. I gave Bill a rundown of what we were talking about as the video played. When video showed Jimmy walking in, Bill asked if I knew who he was. I told Bill that I had seen him around a few times at the bar but had never spoken to him. Video showed me leaving the bar at about 1:45 a.m. Bill asked where I went next. I showed Bill video from my Ring camera, which showed me arriving home at 1:50 a.m. and not leaving until I left for work the following afternoon. Bill explained that it had been Jimmy's body they had found that morning in the park. He said he had an uncashed ticket in his pocket for $560 from the bar. Bill said when they had seen me on the camera, they had to interview me, and the bartender told them where they could find me. Bill also said that they had found Steve walking down the street a few blocks from the scene, covered in blood. As it turns out, Steve was recently homeless and had a history of mental illness. When Jimmy won $560, he attempted to cash it out, but was unable to do so since the bonus round went past 2 a.m. and the bartender could get in trouble for cashing his ticket that late. The bartender had told Jimmy to come back the next day and cash it. Steve, having overheard that Jimmy had won a decent amount, had planned to rob him for it. Steve confessed that he followed Jimmy, who had walked to the bar at the park near his house, where he tried to rob him at knife point. When Jimmy fought back, he cut Jimmy's throat to take the cash, which he didn't have. Steve said he had cut off Jimmy's head with his knife as an attempt to conceal the body. According to Steve, when he realized that he wouldn't be able to hide it, he became scared and left it there. Steve pleaded guilty in court and was sentenced to 85 years in prison. I can feel the concrete refreshing and damp on my fingertips. Its cool weight is pressing against my chest with every labored breath. I can open my eyes, but it's so bright, and the buzzing, it's so loud, drowning out my thoughts. My mind is muddled. Thinking feels like swimming through jelly. I can barely remember where I am or what I was doing. How did I get here? I force another breath. A memory of a blank text message flashes through my mind. I manage to crack my eyes open again. My eyelids scream in protest, but I hold them. My body is trembling involuntarily. Oh God, my legs are starting to go numb. It's so cold. God, I don't want to die. Air hisses through my teeth as I take another breath. Another memory, running through the darkness, running from something. I don't have much time left. The deafening buzz assaults my eardrums. The blinding light sears my eyes. I try to take another breath, but I can't push against the concrete anymore. I feel the backs of my eyelids grinding like sandpaper against my eyes, shutting. It's dark. As the final specks of yellow light fade, memories crisp and sharp like ice water fill my mind. I can't help but begin to remember. Today was so normal, so why is the night so bright? And why can't I move? That's right. My name is Tim. An unimportant name for an unimportant person, I guess. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't say that because I have low self-esteem or anything. It's just a painfully true matter of fact. You see, I'm a secretary for a mid-sized warehouse. We mostly ship farm equipment to local hardware stores. I'm sure it sounds fine on paper, but honestly, this job's been eating away at me for years. The pay's nothing special. The office politics are draining, and my life is an endless cycle of paperwork, emails, and meetings. Some days, I can't think of anything worse than sending out the same set of auto-filled memos and canned phone calls over and over again to the same people on repeat. Every day is a reset, the same tasks, the same questions. Nothing I do makes a permanent impact. It's like a bad version of Groundhog Day without Bill Murray's comic relief. The only inconsistent thing here is what time I clock out. On good days, I finish my to-do list by 3 p.m. and go straight home. On bad days, the list still gets done by 3 p.m., but my boss decides to keep everyone around until 5 p.m. anyway. I'm not sure if he does this because some of my lazier coworkers complain when others go home early, or if he's just trying to kiss corporate ass by pretending to be productive, but it's demoralizing either way. Anyway, today was one of the bad days. I was sitting at my desk, an old Excel sheet open next to my email so I would look busy. "Whoa, excited to go home, Tim?" Pat's hand dug into my shoulder. I tried not to recoil. "Of course not, Pat. Just living the dream, you know," I said through clenched teeth. I craned my neck around, making eye contact with my boss. He grinned. The wrinkles above that disgustingly fake smile didn't reach his eyes. Right. Well, feel free to head home after you lock up. And remember, only one day until the weekend," he said. His hand lifted, followed by jingling as a lanyard full of keys landed on my desk in a clatter. I wanted to object, but he was already gone. Of course, I would have to lock up. By the time I checked the last door, it was well after 5 p.m. The sun was well below the horizon, and my eyes were burning with exhaustion. I turned the lock in the final glass door with a click, pocketed the keys, nodded to my reflection, and turned around. Cold pinpricks danced up my spine as I looked out over the dark parking lot. Maybe it was the exhaustion, but the parking lot felt off tonight. Too empty, too still. Even the air seemed heavier, like the world was waiting for something to happen. The silhouette of my car waited menacingly at the end of the lot, like a beast crouching in the shadows. A lone pole light cast a flickering cone from the center of the lot. I took a breath and walked quickly toward my car. As I entered the cone of light halfway across, I froze. Another jolting tingle, more intense than the last, freezing my body in place. The moment I stepped into the light, it had stopped flickering, as though in reaction to my presence. I craned my neck upwards, searching for an explanation in the light bulb fixture, but finding none, except, was the light getting brighter? And now that I looked closer, the light seemed to oscillate, shifting between a sickly yellow and pale green. The shifting hues were captivating, but felt somehow more threatening than relaxing, like the rasping rhythmic breaths of a wolf standing over its prey just before it lunges for the kill. My phone buzzed. I jumped, letting out a startled yelp. It must be Pat texting me again. I sighed. He could never just trust someone to finish a job on their own, could he? Ever, the micromanager, chastising myself for being so anxious. I unlocked my phone, opening my texts to find nothing. No notification. No overbearing message. No missed call. Just nothing. My breath caught as my gaze drifted past my phone to the ground at my feet. A dusting of moth corpses bathed in the yellow light, blending in with the pavement. Not a single wing so much as twitched amidst the congregation of lifeless husks. The air felt thick. I held my breath, the potential act of moving feeling, like the trigger to spring a trap. This was silly. Was someone messing with me? This would be psychotic even for Pat. After what felt like minutes, I dared to breathe again, the tension in my body making the inhalation rigid and uneven. I hadn't heard anyone nearby. The night was as silent as it was still. There wasn't even a breeze to rustle the leaves. This had to be a coincidence, a random messed up occurrence of nature. I strode to my car, speeding up as the corpses protested with a cacophony of deafening crunches and thunderous pops beneath my feet. I pushed down a sense of nausea and strode on. At this point, I just wanted to get out of here. As quickly as I could, I entered my car, locked the door behind me with a clunk, and floored it out of the parking lot and onto the wooded lane which led to the main road. I rubbed my temples and turned on the radio, trying to push the memory of the moths from my frazzled mind. Just a dying light bulb and a few dead moths. That's all it was. As I stopped to turn onto the main road, I took a final glance in my rearview mirror. I could almost swear I saw the light in that damn parking lot start to flicker again in the distance, the cone narrowing into a slit like the eye of a predatory beast. I wonder, what mysteries does this door contain? The thought clung to my mind like fog as I paced back and forth in the dim corridor of my old house. I hadn't lived here long. Bought the place cheap after the previous owner passed suddenly. A quiet man, they said, kept to himself. The kind of man you barely noticed until he wasn't there anymore. It was strange, though. I'd walked down this hallway 1,000 times since moving in, but tonight, something was different. There, at the end, a small door. A door I swear hadn't been there before. What the hell? I muttered under my breath, half amused, half spooked. Curiosity won. Well, it never hurts to investigate, right? I twisted the old brass handle. The door gave way with a low, mournful creak that echoed unnaturally down the hallway. The moment it cracked open, a cold draft slithered out, carrying with it the faintest sound of chains rattling. What the fuck was that? I paused, my hand still on the handle. The door wasn't locked. Nothing was obstructing it. So why the chains? My mind raced through the possibilities. Old pipes, maybe something in the walls. I pushed the door open wider and the hallway light spilled into the room beyond. That's when I saw him. A small figure crouched in the shadows, trembling. My breath caught in my throat. Chains clinked again as the light fell across him, glinting off the shackles on his wrists and ankles. My stomach churned. Who the hell would do this to a kid? I stepped inside, my feet moving before my brain could catch up. Hey kid, I whispered softly, trying not to startle him. His body shook with barely audible sobs, so faint I almost questioned if I'd heard them at all. I knelt beside him, my voice gentler this time. It's okay, I'm not gonna hurt you. Slowly I reached out, wrapping my arms around him. Just a small embrace to let him know he wasn't alone. He stiffened at first, his body rigid, but gradually he melted into my arms, the sobbing fading to nothing. What's your name? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his small, thin voice stammering out a response. Alex. Alex, I repeated. Okay, Alex, are you alone here? I knew better than to overwhelm him with questions, but I had to know. What the hell was going on in this house? He shook his head. No, there used to be a man. He gave me food. I froze. A man? The last owner? But he'd been dead for months. Does the man still come? I asked, my pulse quickening. Alex shook his head again, his voice quivering. It's been a few days. I finally noticed just how thin he was, his cheeks hollow, his skin pale. Whoever this boy was, he hadn't eaten in days. My chest tightened. Come with me, I said gently, standing up. Let's get you some food. I reached for his hand, but the heavy sound of chains pulled me back to reality. Wait here, I said, my heart sinking. The poor kid couldn't go anywhere, not like this. I rushed to the kitchen, grabbed the only thing I had that seemed gentle enough on an empty stomach, a bowl of plain porridge. When I got back, his eyes lit up like a dying flame reignited. Eat slowly, I said, handing him the bowl. You're starving, but you don't want to make yourself sick. The way he wolfed it down at first, I could tell he hadn't eaten anything decent in a long time, but he listened to my warning, eventually slowing his pace, savoring each bite like it was the best meal he'd ever had. Thank you, he said, and for the first time, his voice was steady. No stuttering, no shaking. My heart ached. What kind of hell had this kid been through? Don't worry, I said, smiling softly. From now on, I'll take care of you. His emerald eyes looked up at me, wide and innocent. Forever and ever? The small pinky finger reached out like a child making a promise. I laughed lightly, touched by his innocence. Forever and ever, I promised, intertwining my pinky with his. But first I had to figure out how to get those damn shackles off. I'll get someone to unlock these for you, okay? The change in him was immediate. His face went pale, his body tensing all over again, trembling like a leaf in the wind. No, he whispered, shaking his head. Please, Don't bring anyone else. Just you." I frowned. Whoever had done this to him had clearly scarred him far beyond the physical chains. Okay, I said quickly. "I'll figure it out." And so for days, I scoured the internet, watching tutorial after tutorial on lockpicking. It took longer than I'd expected, but one night, finally, I heard the soft click of the shackles opening. "Got it," I whispered triumphantly, slipping the iron cuffs from his wrists. I looked up at him, expecting a smile, but he only stared blankly at the open doorway. "Let's go outside, Alex," I said, reaching for his hand. "You're free now." But he didn't move. His eyes flickered to the dark threshold, and he shook his head violently. "Not yet," he muttered. I sighed, ruffling his snowy white hair. "Okay, when you're ready." Days turned into weeks, and I tried everything I could think of to coax him out. I brought toys, books, painted the walls of his small, bleak room a cheery light blue, but no matter what I did, Alex never left that room. That's when I had the idea to introduce him to someone else. My best friend Layla was always good with kids. Maybe she could help. The day Layla arrived, she was brimming with excitement. "Finally, I've been dying to meet this Alex you've been talking about." I grinned, leading her to the room. "He's shy, but once he meets you, I'm sure he'll warm up." I opened the door, but Alex wasn't sitting on the bed like usual. He was lying down, his body completely still. "Alex." My voice wavered as I rushed to his side. "Alex, wake up!" Layla stood frozen, her face drained of all color. "Sarah, step away from him." "What? No, he's just fainted. We need to call an ambulance." But Layla's eyes were wide with horror. "Sarah, that boy is dead." I stared at her, disbelief and fury bubbling up. "What the fuck are you talking about? He's not dead. We have to save him." Suddenly the door burst open, and the room flooded with officers. They grabbed me, pulling me back as I screamed and thrashed. "Help him, please! Alex needs help!" But the officers just looked at me with disgust, as if I was the monster. In that moment, as I was dragged away, I caught a glimpse of Alex. His face sunken, his skin a sickly gray, and his body lifeless. But in my heart, he was still the most beautiful boy I had ever seen. "Hey," Carl, the night guard, muttered to his partner as they stood by the cell. "What's her deal? She's been screaming about some kid named Alex since they brought her in." The other guard, Alan, glanced at the woman rattling the bars, her eyes wild with desperation. Apparently, she was found cradling a corpse. The kid had been dead for years, but she swears he's alive and calls him the most beautiful person she's ever seen. Carl shook his head, eyes wide with disbelief. "That's messed up." Alan nodded grimly. "Yeah, but here's the weird part. That new recruit with the white hair and green eyes, he looks just like the kid she's talking about." Carl turned pale. "You're kidding me, right?" Alan didn't answer. The woman in the cell had stopped screaming now, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting. The pole man. That's what I call him, although he's neither a man nor a pole. I understand there may be a few of you who think it's a silly title for what very well may be a monster or demonic entity, but it makes sense, and it doesn't need some epic name anyhow. It's not some magnificent beast of legend. Rather, it's an unnerving cryptid that's actually quite benevolent, if you don't notice it or him. I first saw him walking down the street one night. My part of the city is in the slums. I'm a factory worker making pennies trying to save up for college to make something of myself, and the rent there was cheap. The streets there are filled with abandoned buildings, graffitied with boarded up windows, and the streets themselves are a Frankenstein mash of cobblestone from the 19th century and modern asphalt, because the city thought it was good for tourists here for the history, and also didn't want to pay money to completely fix it. Even as a man, I felt unsafe walking around at night and carried a switchblade with me because I couldn't afford a gun. However, my anxiety about being mugged didn't outweigh my desire for a late-night convenience store run. My check had come through on my bank account extremely late, and the little store up the street has hot dogs rolling under heat lamps, chips, and energy drinks, all perfect for a midnight movie binge. I couldn't sleep, thinking about how much I hated our economy and despised capitalism, how much more I had to save to go to college, and to cheer myself up, I was going to watch some horror flick classics until I passed out at the crack of dawn. So, I was on my way towards that little convenience store, pulling my jacket tighter over me as a gust of autumnal wind blew through when I noticed it. One of the many telephone poles which cluttered the area looked different than the rest. I can't fully explain it, it was just off, like an extremely difficult game of spot the difference. There were a couple of broken and flickering lampposts on this block, and the tops of the telephone poles were heavily shadowed as they towered above the orbs of yellow glow the posts emanated. Their wires branched out, weaving in between rooftops, connecting to each other like a web. Of course, I wasn't gonna puzzle and ponder over a utility pole, so I kept walking, reaching the middle of the street where it was. I bustled past it, my hands shoved into my pockets for warmth, and I only made it a few steps before I stopped in my tracks. I had heard a creak, just barely noticeable under the blanket of nighttime noise, like the sound of cars honking and driving on a busier road some miles away, and distant police sirens. Now, my first thought was, holy shit, is this thing ready to fall on me? I turned around and looked up at it while continuing to back away. That's when I realized that it wasn't a utility pole at all. It was a living, breathing creature, which looked identical to one. The part of the pole which was shadowed heavily had two glowing pinpoints for eyes, which stared down at me with a strange sense of intelligence. The wires, or whatever they were, which branched out from what may have been his head, quivered and twitched as if they were limbs, something I hadn't noticed before. Two of those limbs disconnected from the wires they were mimicking and hung down at his sides, making it clear they were black, tendril-like arms. The reason I call it a he is because he moaned in a gravelly voice that sounded masculine, like an ancient man disturbed from his deep slumber. Then, he leaned his misshapen head forward, lifting a wiry arm towards me, and I finally broke into a run, and I didn't stop until I reached the convenience store, which glowed like a Christmas tree on the otherwise dark curb. The man behind the counter gave me a weird look as I entered, breathless and terrified. I ignored his gaze and wandered about the store, trying to process what I'd seen. I noticed the man behind the counter was eyeing me warily, probably thinking I was some junkie tweaking out, and he seemed on the verge of telling me to leave. I told myself that I was hallucinating from lack of sleep and gathered up the items I'd come for. I checked out at the register and left with my food in a little white bag swinging next to my thigh. Jesus Christ, I didn't want to walk down that street again, so I went out of my way to find a different route, which would take me longer to get back to my apartment. So yeah, I went the opposite direction and turned down a street I'd never used before, planning to get back to the street my apartment complex was on without passing that same pole again. I was almost home, and I could almost taste the cheap junk food and feel the warm comfort of my bed as I snacked and watched TV. I just wanted to stay awake until dawn. I wanted to be in the safety of my apartment, and I was almost there. But of course, it wouldn't be so simple. I heard a low moan, which sounded like misery and unrest, and I looked up and saw that the utility pole on the curb of the right-hand side of the street up ahead was actually the pole man again. He stood out more than he did before. There was no brown wood, just a weird, black, cylindrical body with many arms and hairs as thin as wires. Its head was like a hammer shape, sprouting long hairs, and its eyes glowed yellow like the lampposts. His stare was fixed solely on me. He was big and overwhelmingly tall, and the only thing he wanted to focus on was me, which felt like being a lone insect, singled out by that one sadistic kid who liked to rip the legs off bugs. There was no one else on this street, and the windows of the few shoddy-looking houses on this block were black, letting me know everyone was fast asleep. The look we gave each other was like the stare down of a predator and its prey. I looked at him with total fear and confusion, wondering if I was losing my mind, and he looked at me with something I could only describe as hatred. It didn't have any expression, At least, not from what I could see standing where I was, but I could feel it, like how you feel someone's eyes on you from across a room. Feel them burning holes into the back of your head. This thing, I got the feeling that he didn't want to be noticed, and now that I had noticed him the first time around, he was going to notice me in return. But his attention would be malicious, unlike mine. He stood there in the dim lighting, still looking like a silhouette, as if he was covered in darkness, and it felt like he was a sentinel whose only purpose was to ensure I didn't make it past him. So I turned and ran back, attempting to go the original route and retrace my initial steps from the convenience store. I ran past the store and down a block, turning and feeling hope shine inside me like a beacon, as I knew I only had 2 blocks left to go. I felt something thin and wiry brush along my back and screamed, propelling myself forward and running even faster than I thought possible. I dropped the bag in my hand and didn't even look behind me. I didn't need to look behind me to know that I was so hell-bent on getting back home that I forgot to survey the street for the pole man and had inadvertently ran right under him. His touch burned like an extremely scorching hot light bulb, grazing my skin, and then it itched something fierce, like 1,000 mosquito bites. I turned the final corner and saw my apartment complex standing at the end of the street, but he was also there, right across from it, looking for all the world like a thick vertical black line, with fine tendrils wriggling and waving in the air. He now swayed gently side to side like a tree. The more I looked at him, the more angry he seemed to get, swaying even more violently and moaning like a disturbed animal. But I was damned if I was going to stay out in the street all night. I ducked out of sight behind a building and made my way to my complex's back door through the back alleys. I punched in numbers in a keypad and went straight for my front door on the 3rd floor, and the first thing I did was close every curtain inside. My living room and bedroom window faced the street, and I yanked those drapes shut before I even gave myself a chance to look at him again. Although I couldn't afford to, I took a few sick days, too afraid to step outside even during the daytime. I didn't end up watching any horror movies. I watched light-hearted comedies and romances instead, as I tried to scrub the image of that monster out of my mind. I have no idea what it was, or what it wanted. Well, I suppose it wanted to go unnoticed, if anything, but what it was doing in the urban area of a city, I have no clue. But that was the last encounter I actually had with it, and it left me with an angry red imprint on my back, like someone had whipped me with a wire. I moved into a better area in a month, rooming with someone so it wouldn't be too expensive. And once in a blue moon, the few times I must go out at night, I do hear the solemn creaks of a utility pole looming just out of my line of sight. Instead of looking directly towards the sound, though, I decide not to give him any sort of unwanted attention. So if you ever experience something like this, I implore you to do the same and not look into things too hard when you're alone and it's dark and eerie outside. I just believe some things in this world were simply not meant to be perceived, and the pole man is one of them. You may be at work, you may be at church, you may be asleep. God grant that you will be ready when he makes his personal appearance. What if his appearance occurs on a Sunday morning? I wasn't much for church, never had been. My wife, though God, she was devout. Every Sunday morning, like clockwork, she'd be there, waiting for me at the door, her Bible tucked under her arm, that hopeful look on her face like a dog expecting a treat. Every Sunday, I'd tell her the same thing. Maybe next time. She'd just smile that tired smile and go alone. But this Sunday was different. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe it was the way the sun broke through the curtains that morning, like God himself had found his way into our bedroom. Maybe it was just the silence of the house, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. Maybe it was the weight of her absence that had been pressing down on me for weeks now, ever since, well, you know. So when she asked me again, her voice soft and uncertain, I didn't say no. I just nodded, dragged myself out of bed, and got dressed. That Sunday was going to be the last time I'd ever see her alive. As we drove on, the road opened up, fields stretching out on either side, the trees thinning out. I could see the steeple in the distance now, rising up from the cluster of buildings around it. The small church sat on a patch of land just off the road, surrounded by old oak trees. My wife had always been drawn to these churches, the ones filled with energy, where the sermons were loud and fiery, and the choir sang with a kind of raw emotion that could shake the walls. She didn't just like going to church, she loved the kind of service where the spirit felt like it was alive, moving through every pew, where the preaching wasn't just reciting scripture, but something more, a performance, a celebration, a battle for your soul. It's not like the quiet services I grew up with, she'd tell me. It's real. When they sing, you feel it. When the preacher talks, it's like God is talking directly to you. There's nothing else like it. She had started going to this particular church a few years ago, just to try it out. It was mostly African American families, and she liked how different it felt from the quiet, stiff services we'd gone to when we first got married. The way the choir would start a song and the congregation would stand up, clapping and moving in time with the music. People shouting Amen and Hallelujah from the pews, hands raised to the ceiling, like they were pulling the spirit down into the room. There were praise breaks moments in the middle of a sermon when the music would suddenly swell, the drums and piano kicking up in rhythm, and the whole place would erupt in celebration. People dancing, shouting, the preacher working the crowd like an old revivalist, sweating through his suit as he called down fire and brimstone in the same breath as love and forgiveness. My wife loved that. She said it was the kind of church where the Holy Spirit didn't just visit it. The tires crunched over the gravel as we pulled into the small lot beside the church. The building stood there, simple and unassuming, with faded white siding that had seen too many summers. It wasn't one of those grand, towering churches with stained glass and marble floors. No, this place was humbler, the kind of church built with hard work and faith, not for show, but for the people who filled it every Sunday. A single cross sat at the very top, weather-beaten but still standing tall, casting a shadow over the entrance as the sun rose higher in the sky. There was a small bell tower beside it, though the bell had long stopped ringing for services. The roof was sloped, the shingles dark with age and wear, but the building itself had a sturdy, comforting look, like it had been holding people together for years. The doors were wide, painted a deep red, with brass handles that glinted in the light. A few small stained glass windows peeked out from either side, splashes of color that caught the eye but didn't overpower the plainness of the rest of the structure. Inside, I knew there would be 3 rows of pews, nothing fancy, just enough to seat the regulars and a few newcomers. The kind of seating arrangement that made sure everyone felt like they were part of the same congregation, no one too far from the action at the front. The pulpit was modest, just a wooden stand where the preacher would work his magic, and behind it, the choir would be seated, waiting to fill the room with music. We stepped out of the car, the morning air still clinging to the last traces of coolness before the Texas heat kicked in. She adjusted her dress, smoothing out the fabric before taking my hand. Together, we walked up to the entrance, her heels clicking on the stone steps. When we reached the door, she paused for a moment, turning to look at me with that soft smile of hers, the kind that said she was glad I came. I nodded, and with a deep breath, she reached for the handle. The doors creaked as they opened, a low sound that echoed like a whisper of everything about to unfold inside. The doors swung open as we stepped inside, and the sound of the music hit us like a wave. The hum of the organ mixed with the bright, rhythmic claps of the congregation, and the air was thick with energy, almost electric. The familiar melody of the song filled the space, the pastor's voice booming above it all as he sang, "The presence of the Lord is here. I feel it in the atmosphere." The sanctuary was medium-sized, but felt alive with its own pulse. 3 rows of pews stretched from the front to the back, each one nearly filled, the congregation swaying in time with the music. The walls were a soft cream, with wooden beams arching across the ceiling, and there were small windows along the sides, letting in streams of light that caught the dust in the air. Behind the pulpit, a massive cross hung on the wall, gleaming in gold against the backdrop of red curtains. The choir stood in matching robes, deep burgundy with gold accents, some with their hands raised, others clapping, their voices rising in harmony. A tall woman in the front of the choir, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, led the soprano section, her voice soaring effortlessly above the others. To her right, a younger man, wide-shouldered and serious, kept time with his hand, his deep baritone anchoring the melody. On the far left, a teenager with glasses and braids swayed with the music, her eyes closed, lost in the moment. The drummer was tucked behind a glass shield off to the side, his hands flying across the kit. Each beat seemed to fuel the song, the sharp snare hits cracking like thunder. The glass shield around him was there to soften the sharpness, letting the rest of the music blend without losing the power of the drums. His dreadlocks swung as he leaned into every rhythm, his focus locked in, eyes half closed, as if the music carried him somewhere else entirely. As we walked further inside, the bass from the organ filled the room, the keys pressed by the organist who sat perched in this corner. The bass lines rumbled through the floor, vibrating underfoot, as if the very foundation of the church was caught up in the praise. Other instruments joined in, a trumpet here, the plucking of a bass guitar there, and all of it weaved together, creating something that felt more than music. It was a kind of communal heartbeat, a rhythm everyone was connected to. The congregation wasn't just sitting, they were part of the music. Hands clapped, feet tapped, and voices rose. In the pews, a middle-aged woman with her Sunday hat tilted slightly to the side stood up, raising her hands to the ceiling, eyes closed, as she mouthed the words, "The presence of the Lord is here." Beside her, a man in a crisp suit nodded along, tapping his fingers against the edge of the pew. My wife squeezed my hand, leading us down the aisle as we found an empty spot on the 5th row from the front. As we slid into the pew, I could feel the vibration of the music even stronger now. The seats were old but worn in a way that felt familiar, like generations of people had sat here, sharing the same feeling. The pastor's voice boomed again, this time more intense as he sang, "The power of the Lord is here." The choir echoed, and the congregation joined, voices overlapping, creating a sound that filled every corner of the church. I sat down next to her, the music carrying us both, as the doors behind us closed with a quiet thud. The pastor's voice rose higher, his energy infectious, as he continued, "The Spirit of the Lord is here." The choir harmonized with him, their voices weaving in and out like the swell of a tide. The music intensified, and the congregation's claps grew louder. The organist's fingers danced over the keys, filling the room with a rich, full sound, while the drummer's steady beat drove the song forward. I feel it in the atmosphere. The power of the Lord is here. The pastor sang with fervor, his hands raised, encouraging everyone to join in. Put your hands together, make some noise if you feel his presence. The congregation erupted, clapping harder, some shouting out, "Hallelujah" and "Amen." The choir took it up a notch, the sopranos' voices soaring as they belted out, "The power of the Lord is here." The drums kicked in louder, the sound reverberating through the glass shield, while the bass guitar added a deep thrum beneath it all. The brass section lifted the melody with bold, bright notes, each trumpet blast punctuating the energy of the moment. The pastor called out again, "The presence of the Lord is here." And the entire church echoed back with a unified voice, "The presence of the Lord is here." The energy in the room was palpable, buzzing, as people in the pews stood to their feet, hands raised high in praise. Then, as if on cue, the music took a slight pause before the pastor's voice rang out again. "Everybody blow the trumpets and sound the alarm." The trumpets hit a triumphant note, and the choir joined in. "The Lord is in his temple. Let everybody bow." The congregation responded with their voices, clapping and swaying as if they could feel the presence of something holy wrapping itself around them. The song climbed higher, the pastor repeating, "The power of the Lord is here." The choir followed, "I can feel the presence of the Lord." The drums hit harder, the rhythm so strong that it made the floor beneath the pews vibrate. "I can feel the presence of the Lord, and I'm going to get my blessing right now." The church responded with joy, the sound of praise filling every corner. The pastor's voice rang out once more. "Can't you see him working on the outside? I can feel him moving on the inside." His voice was filled with conviction, urging the congregation to believe, to feel it. The choir echoed back, the music swelled, and people began to shout out their own praises, some standing in the aisles, hands raised, swaying with the music. As the final chorus neared, the pastor led one last powerful call. "I can feel the presence of the Lord, and I'm going to get my blessing right now." The choir, the instruments, and the congregation all came together in one glorious crescendo, filling the church with a sound so full and vibrant it seemed to lift the very air around us. The song reached its exhilarating climax as the drummer struck the cymbals with a final resounding crash, perfectly timed with the organ's last powerful chord. The choir's harmonies intertwined beautifully with the instruments, creating a vibrant tapestry of sound that enveloped the church. With that, the song wrapped up like a beautifully tied bow, leaving the congregation buzzing with energy and spiritual fervor. As the last notes faded, the pastor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the lingering echoes. "Does anyone else feel the presence of the Lord?" he exclaimed, his tone rising high above the hushed atmosphere. The drummer continued to punctuate his words with rhythmic beats, while the organist skillfully smashed the keys, intertwining their sounds into a celebratory crescendo. "I didn't hear you. I said, did anyone else feel the presence of the Lord?" he yelled, the power of his voice igniting the congregation once again. "Hallelujah!" he cried out, his passion reverberating through the sanctuary, igniting a wave of enthusiasm among the people. As the pastor's hallelujah echoed through the room, the atmosphere shifted. The initial excitement slowly transformed into a palpable energy, with individuals still shouting hallelujah in response, their voices a chorus of praise filling the air. A few seconds passed, the sound gradually softening, yet the spirit of worship remained alive as members of the congregation called out to one another, affirming their shared experience. Finally, the exuberant shouts subsided into an eager anticipation, and the pastor held up his hands, beckoning for silence. The soft rustle of movement filled the air as people settled into their pews, their eyes fixed on him. With a warm smile and a commanding presence, the pastor began to speak, his voice steady and inviting. "Beloved, today we gather not just to feel his presence, but to understand the power that comes with it." As he continued, the church transformed from a whirlwind of sound and movement into a sanctuary of focused attention, ready to receive the message that would inspire their hearts and souls. The pastor stood tall at the pulpit, his presence commanding our attention. I could feel the energy in the room shift as he grasped the edges of the lectern, leaning slightly forward, his voice resonating with fervor. "Beloved," he began, his voice rich and powerful, "today I want to speak to you about a divine promise woven into the very fabric of our faith. It's a promise of transformation, a promise of glory, a promise of our Lord's return." When I read the text amidst all the powerful truths laid before us, it was the word "when" that captivated me most. When, the moment that changes everything. When, the promise of rapture. A sense of anticipation filled the air, and I leaned in, captivated by his words. The pastor paused, scanning our faces, and I noticed a few heads nodding in agreement, while others clutched their Bibles tighter, anticipation building. He raised his hands, palms upturned, inviting the Holy Spirit to fill the room. "Let me tell you, church, There is a day coming when the skies will split open and the Lord will descend. When is not just a word, it's a promise that fills us with hope and anticipation. His voice grew stronger with urgency. You see, the Lord knows when he will call his people home. The congregation began to stir, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Some raised their hands, a few calling out, "Amen." My heart raced with excitement as the atmosphere crackled with energy. It is comforting to say, the Lord knows when, especially in a world filled with chaos and uncertainty. We turn on the television, and we see calamity and confusion. The signs are all around us, and there's a growing sense of urgency in our spirits, a realization that the time is drawing near. I felt the weight of his words sink deep into my chest, resonating with the anxieties I'd been grappling with. The pastor's brow furrowed with seriousness, and his voice lowered slightly as he continued. We sit on the edge of our seats and asking, are we there yet? Are we nearing the moment of his return? He stepped away from the lectern, moving closer to the front of the stage, his gestures emphasizing his sincerity. I could see the passion in his eyes, and it stirred something within me, a longing for certainty amidst the chaos. But let me remind you, dear ones, it's not about knowing the hour or the day. What matters is that we know who holds the wheel of this divine journey. I shifted in my seat, feeling a sense of reassurance wash over me. It was true. As much as I wanted answers, the important thing was faith in his plan. Our Father in heaven has a plan, a perfect timing, and while we may not know exactly when that moment will come, we can be assured that it is certain. He extended his arms wide, embracing us all. Just as children trust their parents in the backseat of a car, we can rest in the knowledge that our Heavenly Father has the map, the strategy, and the timing perfectly set. I closed my eyes for a moment, envisioning the journey he described. Could I trust him to navigate the uncertainties of my life? Are we there yet? I don't know if we're at the end of our trials, the culmination of our suffering, or if the harvest is upon us. But I do know that the one who holds our future is faithful, he said, his voice steady and reassuring. My heart swelled with hope as I listened, caught in the rhythm of his words. As the pastor raised a finger to the heavens, his voice reached a crescendo. The day is coming, church, when he will gather us together, and every tear will be wiped away. So let's prepare our hearts and lift our voices in anticipation, because the Lord knows when that glorious moment will be. We will rise to meet him in the air. With that, he stepped back with his eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and reverence, and the congregation erupted in cheers and applause, filling the sanctuary with fervent energy and hope. I felt my spirit lift, caught up in the collective faith of those around me, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. For a brief moment, I felt a sudden shift in the air, a tangible weight that pressed against my chest, foreboding and thick. It was as if time held its breath, teetering on the edge of something dreadful. Then, without warning, a deafening trumpet sounded, its blare reverberating through the very marrow of my bones. The ground shook beneath me, as if an earthquake had struck at the heart of our sanctuary, and I staggered, grinning the new for balance. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, particles dancing in the flickering light as I glanced upward, instinctively shielding my face with my arm. The lights pulsed erratically, flickering like a dying star, casting jagged shadows across the terrified faces of the congregation. In a heartbeat, the pastor collapsed to the ground, his voice silenced in an instant, his body crumpling like a discarded puppet. I watched in disbelief as half the choir followed suit, some slumping, some crumpling, as if their strings had been cut. Panic erupted like a festering wound. People screamed, their voices rising in a cacophony of terror, drowning out the last echoes of the trumpet. I looked around, my heart pounding like a frantic drum in my chest. My gaze landed on my wife, and a chill crawled up my spine. She lay still, her skin a ghostly pale, a waxen mask of lifelessness. Her once vibrant eyes were devoid of color, staring blankly into an abyss that echoed my own disbelief. Then I turned to the pastor's body sprawled on the stage, a stark figure against the bright altar cloth. His hands, once raised in fervent worship, now lay limp at his sides, his face twisted in a final grimace of shock. I felt a jolt of horror. The man who had led us in prayer and song was now just another lifeless form, a vessel emptied of spirit. My throat tightened, but I couldn't cry. I felt detached from the scene unfolding around me, as if I were watching a horrific movie rather than living through it. I turned my head, desperately searching for some semblance of life in the chaos. But what I saw sent my heart plummeting into an icy pit. Half of the congregation was gone, dropped like discarded marionettes, sprawled across the pews and the floor, limbs askew in grotesque positions. Their expressions were frozen in fear, mouths agape, as if they had tried to scream, but found no voice. Then my phone buzzed violently against my leg, the alert shrill and panicked. I fumbled to pull it out, my hands shaking. The message lit up the screen in bold letters. Emergency alert. Unexplained mass casualties reported worldwide. This is not a test. Stay indoors. Do not go outside. A chill shot through me, more paralyzing than the fear that had wrapped its tendrils around my heart. I felt numb, an unwelcome companion in this surreal nightmare. I couldn't process it. I couldn't even fathom the reality of it all. I got up, abandoning my wife, running towards the exit, each step a struggle against the weight of despair pressing down on me. I burst through the doors and looked up at the sky. What I saw froze me in place. Blood rained down in thick, viscous sheets, soaking the ground beneath my feet. People screamed, running in every direction, a frantic swarm like ants fleeing a collapsing nest. A plane plummeted. I stumbled outside, heart racing, and was immediately met with chaos. The sky was a battleground, small fragments of meteorites streaking through the atmosphere like fiery comets, crashing into the earth with explosive force. Each impact sent shockwaves through the ground, igniting flames as they struck trees, sending splintered wood flying and incinerating the underbrush. The air filled with the acrid scent of burning foliage, a dark reminder of the havoc being unleashed. Buildings shuddered as meteorites hit, shattering windows with a sound like thunder. I watched in horror as glass rained down onto the streets, glinting dangerously in the flickering light. People were screaming, panic surging through the crowd as they darted in every direction, desperate to find shelter from the madness. Some scrambled into nearby storefronts, breaking glass doors to slip inside, while others huddled under awnings, trying to shield themselves from the onslaught above. The ground trembled beneath me, a rhythmic shaking that echoed the tumult in the skies. A fire broke out on a tree, flames licking up its trunk, illuminating terrified faces in the growing darkness. The air was thick with the sounds of destruction, the crack of timber splitting, the roar of flames consuming everything in their path, and the frantic shouts of people trying to make sense of it all. Police cars raced past, sirens wailing, lights flashing like a chaotic disco in the streets. They sped by in a blur, weaving through the throngs of panicked civilians, desperately trying to restore order in a world that had unraveled in moments. Fire trucks followed closely behind, their massive engines rumbling as they navigated through the debris-strewn streets, trailing hoses that flapped like wounded serpents in the wind. Ambulances were everywhere, their sirens blaring a mournful chorus, as paramedics jumped from the vehicles, ready to help those injured in the chaos. But the sight of them felt futile amidst the devastation, as the ground trembled beneath the weight of an impending disaster. I turned to look down the street, and my breath caught in my throat. A nearby building was ablaze, the fire bright against the night sky, sending sparks dancing into the air like fireflies in the chaos. The air crackled with heat, thickening with smoke that swirled and coiled, choking the life out of everything around it. A plane suddenly screamed overhead, its engines roaring like a beast unleashed. I barely had time to react before it slammed into a building nearby. A deafening explosion ripping through the air. Glass shattered everywhere, sending shards flying like lethal confetti, and a fireball erupted from the impact, turning night into day with its intense light. People screamed louder, their voices rising in a chorus of panic. A mother clutched her child, pushing past me toward a safer spot as the shockwaves of the explosion rattled the ground. I felt disoriented, trapped in a waking nightmare, and knew I had to find a way through the chaos. With adrenaline surging, I pushed through the throngs of desperate people, each one lost in their own panic. The ground felt unsteady beneath me, the heat from the flames a constant reminder of the danger closing in. I had to keep moving, lost in the chaos as the world around me fell apart. I sprinted back into the church, the familiar threshold now feeling foreign, steeped in the aftermath of an unimaginable disaster. The chaos from outside seeped into the sanctuary, mingling with the lingering echoes of the previous pastor's voice and the remnants of worship. The air was thick with smoke and fear, a disorienting haze that clawed at my throat as I stumbled through the open doors. Inside, the sanctuary was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the mayhem just beyond the walls. The dim, flickering emergency lights cast long shadows across the pews, highlighting the faces of the few remaining souls gathered in the space. I could count around 20 people, scattered and disoriented, some kneeling in prayer, while others remained frozen, their bodies trembling with the weight of grief. I spotted a woman cradling a child in her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks as she rocked back and forth. Nearby, a man knelt beside his partner, his hands gripping their lifeless form, his sobs echoing through the silence, a haunting lullaby of sorrow. Others huddled together, embracing their loved ones who had succumbed to the chaos, clinging desperately to the remnants of life that still flickered in the sanctuary. Then I saw him, the other pastor, still alive, standing at the front, his figure a desperate silhouette against the flickering emergency lights. His face was pale, eyes wide with horror as he scanned the room, taking in the frantic energy that had invaded his once peaceful domain. "It's over!" he yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking with desperation. The sound echoed off the walls, a harbinger of despair. "We've all been left behind." Hello, everyone. Let me begin by telling you that I live in a land steeped in myth and legend, a place where the tale of the vampire was born, and where ghosts are known to sit at the table with the living. Over the years, I've heard all sorts of stories, each more terrifying than the last. Tonight, I will share with you one of my favorites, a tale passed down to me by an old woman from a mountain village. Let's call her Mara. During the Second World War, cities were under siege, people were starving, bombs rained from the sky, and daily life became a perilous ordeal. In hopes of escaping the chaos, many fled to the countryside, seeking refuge in the small, remote villages nestled at the feet of towering mountains. Mara's family was no different. When she was just 17, they left their city home behind, seeking safety in a quiet village far from the war's horrors. Adapting was not easy. Life in the city was vastly different from the hard work and simple existence of the countryside. Yet, with no other choice, they learned quickly, merging into the rhythm of the village. They worked the fields, tended animals, and found solace in the company of their new neighbors. Soon enough, they made friends, proving themselves as hard-working, kind people, and gradually, their new life in the village became a welcome norm. One evening, Mara and her parents visited the neighbors for a small gathering, a common occurrence that offered moments of warmth and distraction from the war-torn world they had left behind. That night, Doru, their neighbor, began to tell a strange and eerie tale from his childhood, a story that would stay with Mara long after the evening had ended. Doru spoke of a man who lived just a few houses down from him. One night, This man heard someone calling his name from outside his window. Thinking it was merely a dream, he dismissed it and went back to sleep. But the next night, at precisely 2 a.m., the voice returned, louder and more insistent. Frustrated and half awake, the man threw open the window and shouted, "Who's out there? What do you want from me at this hour?" That's when he saw it, gleaming eyes, hovering over the fence, staring at him from the darkness. The eyes were unnaturally high, at least 2 meters above the ground. Terrified, he slammed the window shut and rushed to wake his wife. He shook her, trying to call her name, but no sound escaped his lips. He had lost his voice. His wife woke up in a panic, asking what was wrong, but he couldn't hear her either. He had lost his hearing too. From that night onward, the man lived in silence, unable to speak or hear. He would later tell anyone willing to listen about that fateful night, and warned them all, never answer if someone calls your name from the dark. As Doru finished his story, the adults in the room chuckled, dismissing it as a superstition. But Mara noticed something, a tremor in Doru's voice, a nervousness that didn't match the laughter of the others. Curiosity gnawed at her. She asked Doru what had happened to the man, if he was still living in the village or if he had moved away. Doru shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't seen him in years. Another family lives in his house now." It was late, and the guests began to leave. As they walked home through the quiet village, Mara couldn't shake the unease Doru's tale had left behind. The image of the man's haunted eyes and Doru's anxious hands stayed with her. She barely slept that night, tossing and turning until the first light of dawn crept through her window. The moment the sun's rays touched her room, Mara leapt out of bed, dressed quickly, and without waking her parents, slipped out of the house. She was headed to the cemetery, determined to find out more about the man in the story. If he was dead, his grave would reveal the truth. If not, he might have simply moved away, or maybe, just maybe, the entire tale was a fabrication. Lost in thought, Mara suddenly found herself standing among the graves, unsure how she had arrived so swiftly. She began searching, carefully examining each grave, reading every inscription, scanning each portrait for the face of the man from Doru's tale. The cemetery was vast, but she was determined to search every corner, no matter how long it took. By the time she reached the 6th row of graves, her eyes caught sight of a figure in the distance, a man standing alone among the headstones. Thinking it might be the caretaker, Mara hurried towards him, eager to ask if he knew the man she was looking for. But as she got closer, she stopped to catch her breath and froze. The man standing before her was none other than Doru. He looked at her, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You couldn't resist, could you?" he said softly. Mara, startled, asked, "What do you mean? How do you know why I'm here?" Doru sighed and sat down on a nearby bench. "You're looking for the man from my story, aren't you?" He gestured toward the grave in front of him. Mara's eyes fell on the headstone, and there, beneath the photo of an old man, was an unusual inscription. "We will never forget you, and we will never let the darkness enter our home." Shocked, she looked back at Doru. He began to speak, his voice low and filled with sorrow. "Yes, Mara, the man in the story was my father. What I told you happened when I was just a boy. My mother had been sleeping in my room that night because I'd been having nightmares for several nights in a row. I couldn't sleep, though, so I snuck out of bed and went to sit on the porch. I was just a curious 10-year-old staring up at the stars when suddenly the air grew cold and a thick fog descended over the village. I shivered, and then I heard it, my mother screaming for my father. I ran inside and saw everything I described to you last night. From that moment on, people started avoiding our family, whispering that my father had lost his mind and was spreading fear with his stories. He passed away 10 years ago. Now, I'm the only one who still visits his grave." Mara, her voice barely a whisper, asked, "So it's true? The voice that called out to him? It wasn't just his imagination?" Doru looked up at the sky, tears welling in his eyes. No, Mara, it wasn't his imagination. I heard it too, and I've heard it every night since my father died. This story still gives me chills, and I haven't spoken of it in a while. So, flashback to high school. I wasn't the most social guy in school. I had my really close friends, but other than that, I would classify myself as a loner. I had really bad acne, which affected me a lot when meeting new people, and I was very addicted to World of Warcraft. So, it was Friday night. Classic raid night in Vanilla WoW. About 2 hours before the raid, my best friend that I grew up with, let's call him T, called me. He's like, "Yo, bro, I'm meeting up with 2 women later tonight. Let's drink and hang out with these women." It was one of those classic fork in the road moments. Be a nerd and blow another Friday night playing a video game, or go out with my best friend and see if I can finally lose my virginity. Before I get to the next part of the story, I need to give some backstory on T. T was nothing short of a boss, and I truly looked up to him. He is a really good-looking guy and is extremely intelligent. I'm not understating this. He's the type of guy when he walks into a room, all the women just gravitate to him. But T has a dark side. Even though he has everything going on for him, it was never good enough. He got expelled from the school we both went to for having a couple grams of weed, aka just trying to flex, and got caught by a teacher. He was sent to another school about 30 minutes away. Nothing changed, and it actually got far, far worse. He became the guy. He started fucking all the hot chicks and became a massive drug dealer. He supplied about 4 or 5 high schools/colleges in the area and was for sure on the radar of the law and other rivals. Now, back to the story. After playing mental ping pong for about 30 minutes, weighing all the options, potentially get laid, drunk, or nerded up like usual, I finally say, fuck it, count me in for tonight, T. I bribe my brother $20 and he agrees to raid for me. And the night begins. T picks me up from my place and greets me with a big smile and says, "We're getting laid tonight, brother." I'm like, whatever, bro, we'll see. I'm very used to T over-exaggerating. So I quickly ask, when are we meeting up with these women? It's about 9:30 p.m. at this point. Under his voice, he says around 1 a.m. I'm like, WTF? Are we supposed to do in 3.5 hours? T pulls out a bottle of Bacardi 151 with the metal grate and passes it to me. Thankfully, I had been drinking hard that year, so my tolerance was decent. We head to this awesome park to burn time and start passing the bottle back and forth. We catch up on life, and we're about 6 out of 10 drunk at this point. It's around 11:30-ish. With an hour and a half still to burn before we're supposed to meet with said women, T says, let's roll to Taco Bell. We can get some food and sober up. At this point, I'm drunk and we have some time to burn, so what the hell, let's head to Taco Bell. As most degenerates know, Taco Bell is open late, and the one we went to is located in a shopping center. No surprise, around 12 a.m., there are no cars whatsoever in the parking lot, except for the workers of Taco Bell. T rolls up to buy his food, and we just park outside Taco Bell while he eats. While T is eating, I snag a cigarette and get some fresh air. As I puff away on a Marlboro Light, a white van rolls up with tinted windows and no license plate. The van parks to the west of our car, about 50 feet away in this empty parking lot. The lights inside, outside the van instantly turn off and no one gets out. I keep smoking, but I don't think much of it. I mean, we're essentially doing the same thing, but a car with no license plate was obviously weird. I get back into T's car and I start getting a really uneasy feeling about this van. At this point, I've sobered off a little and I just keep eyeing down this van. Something doesn't feel right. It chose to park 3/4 of the way into this parking lot with a perfect view of our car. I turn to T and tell him it's time to leave. This is where the backstory comes into play. As I mentioned, T was in very deep at this point and was at the height of his drug dealing career. So that exact thought was in the back of my mind when this van was parked inconspicuously. This next part is not exaggerated in the slightest. T turns on his headlights to his car to leave, and I shit you not, almost instantly after our lights are on, the white van turns their lights on. My stomach dropped to the floor. At this point, we're both freaking out. T knows he could be busted by the police at any point, and that's not even considering all his rivals' people he's fucked over. So right when we see the light turn on from the van, we turn ours off. And no fucking joke, the van turns their lights off to mimic our reaction. T reaches to the back seat of his car and pulls out a backpack with a weapon in it. I can't believe this actually going down. At this point, I'm inching on crying. This is obviously no coincidence. We were followed to the shopping center. We sat paralyzed in fear and dripping in sweat for the next 10 minutes. Waiting to see if the van would move, it didn't. T starts mumbling to himself. This might be a goon squad that was hired to hunt me down. I'm speechless to that comment. I was a normal, unsocial kid who loved sports and video games, and now I'm in this terrible and possibly life-threatening situation. At this point, I really wish I just stayed home and played World of Warcraft. No potential sex is worth the heart attack I'm currently going through. I felt extremely nauseous, and I'm so close to throwing up. Is this actually happening, or am I dreaming? This doesn't feel like the police. They wouldn't go through this type charade. They would have turned on their lights and arrested us by now. I can't stand this demented showdown we're currently in. I'm on the verge of a mental breakdown and tears are rolling down my face. I turn to T and tell him to turn on his lights one more time. Almost like clockwork, the van flicks on their lights, but this time was very different. I was able to see multiple shadows of hooded men in the van. I turn to T and tell him to f***ing book it out of here. I've never seen someone go 0-60 at a shopping center before, but you can bet your ass we did. T turns his head while exiting the shopping center and sees the van following us at a fast pace. We start cutting down side roads for the next 5 mins. Thankfully, no one is following us anymore. At this point, I'm just staring at T and ask, WTF, was that bro? T says with a weak voice, I have no idea other than what you know I do, aka drug dealing. We take a deep breath. We hit the bottle some more. The next 20 minutes, we sat in silence and came to grips with almost being involved in a sting operation, robbed by rivals, or even worse. Once our heart rates dropped under 250 beats per minute, we finally headed out to meet the women. T and I never spoke of that moment ever again, and to this day, the thought of that night still chills me to the core. Hi, I'm Elizabeth, but everyone just calls me Beth. I was a camp counselor for 6 years, and I absolutely loved it. I enjoyed being outdoors, hanging out with the other counselors, staying in the woods, and teaching the younger campers about the wonders of nature. But then one summer came along that changed everything about that job. Normally, campers would stay for a week and then go home, and counselors would have a week to themselves before the next group arrived. This routine continued from May to August. I remember that summer vividly. It was the last week of camp, and we were all excited for our final week. We had planned a special activity for the kids, which we would surprise them with towards the end of the week. The surprise was a hike into the woods where we would set up a real campsite and spend the last 3 nights sleeping outside by the fire. We had planned to tell ghost stories, roast marshmallows, and make s'mores, but none of that came to pass. As the kids arrived at camp and settled into the cabin, they unpacked their belongings and began chatting, getting to know one another. Except for one camper, whom I later learned was named Max. Our camp is structured differently from others. We allow boys and girls to sleep in the same cabin since our camp caters to ages 6, 10, with separate sides for each gender. Our facilities are quite limited, consisting of a single cabin, a main office, and a cafeteria. Our activities are exclusively outdoors, but we operate on a very tight budget. Max was different from the other campers. He didn't unpack his things. In fact, it seemed he hadn't brought anything at all. He stood in the corner while the other kids claimed their beds. Thinking he might be shy, I walked over and introduced myself. Hello, I'm Beth, and I'll be one of your counselors for this week. Are you ready to have some fun? Max stood there with a blank expression, not saying a word, and simply turned away from me. I suspected he was one of those campers whose parents had forced them to attend, rather than coming of their own volition. However, I was resolute in my determination to lift his spirits. Our inaugural activity was a game of kickball in the clearing. I divided the campers into teams and we commenced the game. The campers were thoroughly enjoying themselves, laughing and playfully accusing each other of making wrong plays, joking and engaging in friendly competition. Then I noticed Max. He had wandered away from the group and was standing off to the side, gazing into the woods. Not wanting to single him out in front of the other campers, I decided to keep a discreet watch on him. He remained there for the duration of the game, and none of the other counselors approached him. Jacob came over to me and asked, "What's going on with that camper over there?" "That's Max. I believe he's a bit introverted," I responded. "I see," Jacob replied before walking away again. It wasn't long before we left that activity and headed to the cafeteria for lunch. After seating the campers, I went to collect their food. I laid it all out on the table, and we all began to eat. Max, however, did not. He simply sat there, staring at his plate. "Aren't you hungry?" I asked him. He looked at me without saying anything. "You should eat before our next activity. It will require a lot of energy. We're going canoeing," I added with enthusiasm, hoping to excite Max as well. Instead, his eyes widened with what seemed like fear, and he lowered his gaze to the ground, maintaining that posture until we finished eating. When we arrived at the river, Jacob, the other counselor, had already set the canoes out on the water and had life vests ready for the kids. We both distributed the vests, helped the campers into them, and then, one by one, sent them out to load into a canoe. When it was Max's turn, his demeanor shifted dramatically from quiet and shy to loud and frantic. He kicked, screamed, and pleaded with us not to make him get in the water, insisting that he was terrified of it and couldn't bring himself to enter. Jacob tried to reassure him, explaining that the lifeguard would be assisting us and that we would be right there if anything were to happen. Max, however, was inconsolable, and it began to feel like we were torturing him by trying to persuade him. "Stop it, Jacob," I said firmly. "I'll sit with him. He doesn't have to do it if he is truly scared. I will not force a camper to do anything they are uncomfortable with." As Jacob, the lifeguard, and the other campers ventured out into the river, I sat on the bench with Max. At first, it was very quiet, just as I had expected, but then Max spoke. "Thank you. You saved me," he said. "No problem, kiddo," I said, ruffling his hair. It felt damp, even though he had never entered the water. Did he shower? No, that couldn't be. I would have noticed, and he hadn't had the time. Eventually, the campers returned from their excursion, and we all headed back to the cabin. Later that night, after I thought all the campers had fallen asleep, I was preparing for bed myself when I saw Max reflected in the mirror behind me. He startled me, causing me to jump and turn around. I laughed it off and said, "Max, you need to go to bed." "I can't sleep," he murmured, his voice sounding weak and muffled. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked him. "I want to go home," he replied. "That's just your nerves. I'm sure if you fall asleep by morning you'll feel a lot better and change your mind. Just try to have a good time. It's only the first night. I promise you'll have fun," I assured him. He turned his gaze to the floor before disappearing into the darkened room where the other campers were already settled. The next morning, during roll call, I discovered that Max was missing. We searched the entire cabin, but he was nowhere to be found. Panicked, I sprinted to the main office and burst into the director's office. "Mr. Tony, I have a missing camper," I exclaimed frantically. "All right, calm down," he said. "We'll find them. What's their name so I can pull up their information, contact their parents, and notify the authorities?" "His name is Max Sumner," I replied. Mr. Tony began typing on his computer, but his expression quickly turned into one of confusion and anger. "Is this some sort of sick prank?" he demanded, his voice rising in agitation. "No, sir, I assure you it's not," I responded, utterly perplexed as to why he would think I'd joke about something so grave. "I have no camper scheduled under the name Max Sumner," he informed me, his tone laced with skepticism. My heart plummeted. Well, then there's a missing child on our campus who was under my supervision. I know what I'm talking about, and we need to find him. He has longer red hair, green eyes, and pale skin with freckles, I insisted, my voice tinged with desperation. We'll call the authorities and see what they can do, Mr. Tony replied. As he contacted the authorities, Jacob and I had the arduous task of calling the other campers' parents to inform them of the situation and ask for their assistance. Some parents volunteered to help with the search, but most arrived only to pick up their children and berate us for losing a child. When the authorities eventually arrived, they dispatched the search team while an officer approached me to obtain a more precise description of the child and his name. His name is Max Sumner, I stated. The officer retreated to his patrol car and returned after a brief interval. He murmured something to Mr. Tony, whose expression shifted to one of anger mingled with a profound disturbance, as if he had just received an utterly bewildering piece of information. The officer then approached me once more, requesting that I describe the boy again. Upon concluding my description, the officer's face darkened with a frown. "We don't find situations like this amusing, ma'am," he said sternly. I'm not joking." "Why does everyone think I'm joking?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration and confusion. "Because Max Sumner was an 8-year-old boy who drowned in the river 4 years ago," the officer replied. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The world seemed to spin around me. It was the same river where we had taken the campers canoeing. It dawned on me then. I recalled his story being broadcast on the news, his photograph. Why hadn't I recognized him sooner? The officer seemed poised to arrest me, but Jacob interjected, affirming that he had also seen Max. The officer recorded both Jacob's and my accounts before departing with the search team. Mr. Tony summoned us to his office to discuss the incident. He furiously accused us of orchestrating a cruel prank about a matter so grave and heartbreaking. Despite our fervent assertions of honesty, the confrontation escalated into a heated argument, ultimately leading to my resignation. I now work as a game warden, allowing me to still enjoy the beauty of nature without the concern of encountering any more spectral children, I hope. It remains astonishing that they were on the verge of arresting me, believing it to be some twisted joke. This is my first time ever posting something like this, but I'm honestly at a loss for words and would honestly just like others' thoughts on this occurrence. This happened Wednesday of last week, October 2nd, 2024. I'm 22 and a manager of a Dollar General. I'd just locked the doors at 10 p.m. and was beginning the usual closing tasks when I got a call from my little brother. He's 17 years old and recently has really gotten into exploring abandoned buildings and climbing large structures like radio towers. I will be honest, his new hobby does fill me with anxiety, but despite being a dumb teenager, he's still somewhat smart about his ventures, except for this time. When I answered the phone, he was asking for my help, told me he had been out exploring an abandoned house he'd come across, and he was just about to leave, but he said his car wasn't starting, that the battery was dead. He also told me that he was alone. Usually he'll be with a buddy, but he's got the kind of fearlessness where he doesn't bat an eye at solo adventures. He didn't want to call our mom either because she was under the impression that he was at a friend's, but instead, he was a whole county away in the middle of nowhere alone. I was pissed about his carelessness, but decided to spare the lecture until I was actually with him. I told him to send me his location, and I would be heading there soon. I got done closing around 10:30 and started speeding along the route the GPS took me. Usually I never speed, but the idea of my little brother out on some Alabama back road broken down alone didn't sit right with me. It took me about 40 minutes to get there. I started off on a pretty busy highway, turned off onto a very remote highway, and rode down that one for a long time. There was nothing but trees, fields, and the occasional tiny church. Eventually, I turned right down a very narrow dirt road that I nearly missed. I had to drive slow, it was very unkempt and bumpy. The tree line on each side was so thick with darkness, and to be honest, the whole vibe of the place made me really uneasy. I just had a bad feeling. I took an extremely sharp turn around a bend and saw my brother's car about a couple hundred feet ahead. Not even 3 seconds after my headlights had even shone onto his car, I see him throw himself out of the car in complete hysterics. He sprinted towards my car, screaming at the top of his lungs for me to unlock the doors. I come to a halt, and he jumps in and locks the door back, not even giving me time to process his distress. He starts shouting at me to get us out of here, and that there's someone else here. I'm an act first, ask questions later type of person, so I immediately turn us around and floor it off that road. I'd never ever seen him in such a panicked state before. He was sobbing, having a full-blown panic attack. I sped down the road, and by the time we made it back to the main highway, he'd calmed down. I asked him WTF happened, or why he didn't call me, but soon realized that he had been too panicked to think about it. He said about 25 minutes after he called me asking for my help, he'd been sitting in his car listening to music and just staring off, when way down the road ahead of him, the figure of a man or human appeared. He said he was worried at first that maybe it was a landowner coming to yell at him, but instead the figure just stood in the middle of the road, clearly looking at him. It was too dark to make out anything about the figure other than they were clearly a person. He said the person just stood there unmoving for a good 3-4 minutes before they very slowly shifted to the right, vanishing into the trees in dark. At this point, pure panic had already set in for him because he was sure they were staring at his car and because of the unusual behavior of the figure. He said they didn't pop out of the trees until another 5 minutes had passed, but this time they had moved a good distance closer. He was fully freaking out now, thinking this person had to be messing with, or even worse, threatening him. He said he froze, his body not letting him do anything except stare out in terror. The figure continued to stand in the middle of the road, and then they shifted back into the tree line. He said the figure did it 2 more times. Each time they had inched a couple feet closer to his car. He said they'd been hiding in the trees again for about a minute once he saw my headlights behind him. The security of knowing I was there now is what gave him the courage to leap out of the car and make a break for it. Poor kid was so petrified, he even left his phone behind in the car. We went back the next day around noon to jump the car off. My paranoid self even brought a weapon. The area was a lot less threatening in the daytime. The abandoned house could be seen through the trees to the left of the road, and to the right, a couple 100 yards behind us, was a smaller road that led to a small radio tower. Given it was bright out, and my urge to know what had happened, I poked around with my brother. Other than the house, thick trees along the road, and the tower, there was nothing but fields to either side of us, no sign of a barn, or a farm, or anything. I even looked around the ground floor of the house. My suspicion was maybe a squatter. He missed in his venture was messing with him, but there was no sign of anyone actually living in the house. What unnerved me even more was the fact that around the back of the house, a good stretch of the ground was littered in bones. They looked like cow vertebrae. There were hundreds of cleanly cut vertebrae everywhere. There weren't even cows in any of the fields nearby. I went back to the road and trekked ahead past his car, down to the stretch where he said the person had been standing. It was a dirt dusty road, so I was looking for footprints, any evidence that something was there, but there was nothing. After that, we jumped the car off. I dug into him a little bit, told him to never go exploring alone again, and then we left. I'm honestly at a loss. He's not the type of kid to make up stories like this, and also that level of distress I saw him in, I don't think anyone could fake either. The day I wanted to forget and haunts me years later. Maybe to some, this isn't terrifying, but for me, it changed my life forever. It made me realize there's another side to our life that we don't fully understand, whether it's an afterlife or a different dimension. A place bad spirits go or something, or a force beyond our understanding. This is about an Ouija board. Of course, my mom always told me never to play with one, but I was a stupid teenager. It was nuts because we didn't actually have a board. My friend just knew how to draw one out. So we got a poster board. She drew it out. We made the makeshift heart thing. She explained how it all works, so we sat around, the 3 of us, and we started playing. I automatically assumed one of my girlfriends was moving it around because it was moving around pretty smoothly and answering all of our questions clearly. That's what I always assume when I hear about people playing. It wasn't till it said something really creepy to us that we kind of started getting mad at each other. We were asking the usual questions teenage girls would ask: who would lose their virginity first? It told us who, what order, at what ages, and the names the guys we would be with. Honestly, it was so descriptive it almost seemed real, but it was strange. The one girlfriend who was religious and really controlled by her parents, it said she would lose it first. At the time, it made no freaking sense. Said I would lose it last, and the other girl in the middle. Then we asked who would get married. It said who would get married. Didn't say the partners' names, but it did say who would get divorced and have kids and whatnot. It said the one girl that was religious would never get married, the other girl would get married and divorced, and I would get married and never divorced. I guess all the questions and answers were just entertaining, but kind of starting to rub the wrong way. No feelings were getting hurt, but it was weird. That's when it started to get weird. One of us asked, will we be friends forever? The whatever it was we spoke to said no, that two of them would be friends, but that they wouldn't be friends with me anymore. I remember getting upset. I looked up, not removing our hands. We were all confused, discussing who's moving it. We all looked terrified. We all swore that none of us were moving it. At that moment, we're all kind of pissed about the things that were being said, because it was kind of offending every single one of us at this point. It was in that moment I knew I wasn't moving it, and I knew they wouldn't lie about this. It was too weird. Everything was so detailed and strange, and it was almost insulting, saying the religious girl would be the one who had sex first and never married. It was saying she would lose it in a car. Why would she say that about herself? At that time, only I had had a BF, so me losing it last seemed off. So everyone was kind of getting offended by the things it was saying, aka one wasn't getting married, one divorced, so as much as it would prop one of us up, it would pull us down too. We ended up asking it to say something that would prove it was real, something that only it knew that we didn't. It said Bruce was cheating on his wife Kelly and they'd get a divorce. Who the heck is Bruce and Kelly? It just kept repeating itself, so we just kind of ignored it and moved on. As teenagers, we didn't really give a shit about people getting divorced. What it said next was really creepy and sent us into a tizzy among all the questions we were asking. After we knew it wasn't us moving it, we looked back down at the board and we didn't say anything. It just started to move. It asked, did we want to know something? And we said, know what? And asked, did you want to know when you're going to die? You got so freaked out, we just pulled our hands off immediately, which I know you're not supposed to do. At that point, we were screaming and not thinking clearly. We got the attention of some of our other friends that were in a different section of the basement, and they came over, asked what the heck was going on. There were two other friends. They were dating and doing God knows what. It's why we banished ourselves to that part of the basement to play this creepy ass game. Her mom was upstairs. It was the only way they could be alone together, is if we were all together. We were using a candle because of this. They were doing stuff over on the other side and wanted the lights dim. They were playing music, so they didn't really hear what was going on until we freaked out. We did explain what happened to the couple. He wanted to play because he thought it was badass. He literally had to talk us into it by taunting us. He said it's all fake. It's not real, that we're just making it up. We said it's real. It's almost like our egos got the best of us, that we forgot how scared we were because we wanted to prove that it was real and knew strange things. Anyway, when we went back to playing, her boyfriend played, but not her. She was too freaked out and went upstairs. Immediately he said, prove that you're real, do something. This should have been the sign that we stopped. It said, get her to play, get her to come back down. It said, I need more of your energy to create something. So her boyfriend yelled. She opened up the door. He persuaded her to come down and he begged her to play. She relented and she played. It just asked us to put our hands on the pointer and wait. I remember time had gone on and we would say, how much longer? And it would say, a few more minutes. Got to the point where our hands were falling asleep. We had kind of forgot speaking amongst ourselves that maybe we should just end it, but her boyfriend didn't want to. Maybe it had been about 10 minutes. We ended up chatting amongst each other about anything else. That ended immediately when her boyfriend and religious girl started screaming and pointed in the direction of where the candle was. They were facing it, so seen it the best. They got up as we turned to look. I looked over, and what used to be a normal candle wasn't anymore. The flame was about 6 feet in the air and blue. It was almost hitting the ceiling. We all screamed and ran up the stairs. As we ran up, we could hear a low, gargling, groaning scream that felt as if it was behind you and got louder and louder. All the hairs on my neck stood up. I have never been so terrified. We ran out her front door, just stood on the front lawn, screaming and crying. One girl peed herself. One girl had a white streak in her hair permanently after. It was one of the most stressful experiences we've ever had as friends. The neighbors almost called the cops, but her mom came running out and was so confused and calmed us down. I think the neighbors thought we were just watching a scary movie or something. Our parents all picked us up. We never really talked about it again, just about how scary it was. It was almost too scary to talk about. Now, for the creepier part, if you've made it this far, remember the part about Bruce and Kelly. Because we were in junior high, all the teachers were called by their last names. We found out our teacher and his wife were getting divorced because he no longer wore his ring. He had a tan line there, and someone asked if he lost his wedding ring. He mentioned his separation from his wife and quickly changed the subject. We later found out his ex's name was named Kelly and his name was Bruce. We were mortified. However, in time it started to fade. I feel memories, scary ones, feel more like a dream. Even a week after it happened, it didn't feel real. You think your mind is playing tricks on itself, and that's how you get over it. That's how you're able to sleep at night. Those girls, years later, stopped being friends with me, just like it predicted. I remember getting a Facebook message from one of them in my mid-20 chess. She asked me about it, if I lost my virginity at the age it said I would slash if the name of the guy was correct. She had informed me her and the other girl, religious one, lost it in the way it said, with the names of the guys it said they would. It hit me like a ton of bricks. We're talking years later, and I had almost forgotten. Trauma kinda does that to you. It said the correct age. My guy's name was wrong, though. It predicted John. That felt good somehow. We left it there. I think it made us feel safe as adults, that it was wrong because it was just all coincidences, right? Maybe the candle wasn't real. We were just teenagers with creative imaginations and remembered wrong. However, that all came crashing down. I didn't realize my European boyfriend's name, if translated, was correct. The name Jan translates to John in English. Sit with that effing creepy. I never told the girl who messaged me on Facebook. I remembered the safe way we felt and didn't want to take that away from her. I'll never understand why it even matters, really. It's almost like it told us things that didn't affect our lives at all, although it did prove that there's something more to our existence. For years, I struggled with sleep paralysis and nightmares that were very vivid. It wasn't until later when I became religious and started believing. And God, it went away. Praying before bed, I got peace. When I was having paralysis or nightmare, the only thing that made it stop is when I would scream, Jesus Christ, whether in my head or out loud. Being a religious person now, I'd never mess around with a spirit board. I don't think anyone should, to be honest. Sometimes I wonder if that's what prompted all my nightmares and those creepy paralysis experiences I had. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I always thought that those stories were just made up to scare people. That was until my grandmother passed away 10 years ago. My grandmother was a kind and gentle woman. She always had a smile on her face and a warm hug for anyone who needed it. Her death was sudden and unexpected, and it left a huge void in our family. After her funeral, I moved into her old house to keep it from being sold. I wanted to hold on to the memories of her that lingered in every corner of the house. But as the years passed, strange things began happening. It started with small things, objects moving on their own, strange noises in the middle of the night. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. But then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it couldn't be possible my grandmother had been dead for 10 years. But the knocking continued, slow and persistent. I mustered up the courage to open the door, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight, filtering in through the window. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside, but the knocking continued every night, growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. I started to feel a sense of dread every time I heard that knocking. It felt like someone or something was trying to get in, to reach out to me from beyond the grave. I confided in my friends, but they thought I was just imagining things. They suggested I see a therapist, that maybe I was struggling with unresolved grief over my grandmother's death, but I knew deep down that it was something more sinister. One night, as I lay in bed trying to ignore the knocking on my door, I heard a whisper in my ear. It was a soft, familiar voice, my grandmother's voice. "Let me in, child," she whispered, her voice filled with longing and desperation. "I miss you so much." I was frozen with fear, unable to move or make a sound. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized that whatever was knocking on my door was not my grandmother. It was something else, something malevolent and hungry. I mustered up every ounce of courage I had and shouted, "Go away, you're not welcome here." The knocking stopped abruptly, and the house fell silent. I lay in bed shaking with fear, not daring to move or even breathe. But then I heard a new sound, the sound of footsteps approaching my door. The door creaked open slowly, and a cold draft of air washed over me. I closed my eyes, unable to bear the thought of what was on the other side of that door. But when I opened them again, I saw her, my grandmother, standing in the doorway, her eyes empty and dark. "Come with me, child," she said, her voice hollow and eerie. "You belong to me now." I screamed and scrambled out of bed, running out of the room and down the stairs. I could hear her footsteps following me, echoing through the empty house. I reached the front door and threw it open, running out into the cold night. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest neighbor's house, where I banged on the door, begging for help. The neighbor called the police, who searched the house but found nothing. They told me it was probably just a figment of my imagination, that grief can do strange things to a person's mind. But I knew the truth. My grandmother was not at peace. She was trapped in that house, reaching out to me from the other side, and I was determined to find a way to set her free. I hired a team of paranormal investigators to help me uncover the truth behind the haunting. They conducted seances, used EVP devices, and even brought in a psychic medium to communicate with my grandmother's spirit. Through their investigations, we learned that my grandmother's spirit was indeed trapped in the house, unable to move on to the afterlife. She was reaching out to me for help, hoping that I could free her from the torment of being stuck in limbo. With the help of the psychic medium, we performed a ritual to release my grandmother's spirit from the house. It was a long and arduous process, filled with fear and uncertainty, but in the end, we succeeded. As my grandmother's spirit finally found peace and moved on to the afterlife, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The knocking on my bedroom door stopped, and the house fell silent once again. I moved out of that house shortly after, unable to shake off the memories of the haunting that had taken place there. But I knew that my grandmother was finally at peace, and that was all that mattered. To this day, I still can't explain what happened in that house. Some may call it a trick of the mind or a figment of imagination. But I know the truth. My grandmother was reaching out to me from beyond the grave, and I was the only one who could help her find peace. And in the end, that's all that truly matters.